Sarah Mitchell slid quietly into seat 22C, the kind of middle seat most travelers dreaded. For her, the choice was deliberate. She wanted to disappear, to be another anonymous passenger on a crowded flight. After 2 tours overseas, months spent in cockpits above hostile terrain, and years of endless training, she had learned to value invisibility. Recognition came with questions, praise, or worse, mockery. In civilian clothes, she thought she could pass unnoticed. The cabin hummed with the familiar orchestra of travel overhead bins slamming shut, the high-pitched whine of the air system, children fussing, and the constant shuffle of bodies finding their seats. Sarah kept her posture upright, backpack tucked neatly under the seat ahead, hands folded on her lap. The man assigned to 22B arrived late, wrestling a carry-on that seemed too large for the overhead compartment. He sighed dramatically when a flight attendant insisted he gate-check it. Sliding into his seat, he gave Sarah a quick glance. His eyes flicked toward the small military patch, stitched discreetly on her backpack. The corners of his mouth curled into a knowing smirk, though he said nothing yet. Passengers continued filing in. A woman across the aisle was speaking loudly into her phone, complaining about security lines. A teenager behind Sarah kicked the seat rhythmically, absorbed in a handheld game. It was the usual chaos before takeoff, the kind of background noise Sarah had learned to tune out in combat briefings and tense cockpits. Then it happened. Her phone, set to vibrate, lit up with an incoming message. The vibration nudged it against her armrest, and she instinctively grabbed it before it fell. The screen glowed with an alert, and with it, her ringtone slipped through an unmistakable sound. The roaring thunder of a jet engine spooling up, followed by the sharp crack of afterburners. The sound wasn't long, barely 3 seconds, but it was enough. The man in 22B raised an eyebrow, his smirk broadening. "Wow," he said loudly, just enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Somebody really wants everyone to know she's a pilot." A few chuckles floated from surrounding rows. Sarah silenced the phone quickly, tucking it into her pocket. She kept her face calm, eyes forward, shoulders squared. Years of training had taught her not to react under pressure. But inside, her chest tightened. The man wasn't finished. He leaned back, stretching his arms with exaggerated casualness. "You know," he continued, his voice carrying easily over the cabin noise, "people usually pick ringtones they think make them look cool. Rock songs, movie themes, but jet engines? That's a new one." More laughter. Someone behind her muttered, "What is she? Top Gun's cousin." A ripple of amusement spread, subtle but cutting. Sarah felt the heat rising in her cheeks, though her expression remained neutral. She had faced radio chatter from enemy pilots, missile locks screaming in her cockpit, and the cold, endless silence of night patrols. Yet here, in this cramped cabin, the ridicule of strangers pricked sharper than shrapnel. The woman across the aisle added her own comment, half hidden behind a smile. Maybe she's trying to impress someone. Her tone dripped with sarcasm, and the man in 22B chuckled approvingly. Sarah inhaled slowly through her nose, the same way she had during survival training when instructors hurled insults to test mental resilience. She pressed her palms flat against her thighs, grounding herself. She could hear her instructor's voice echoing in memory. "Composure is the weapon. Don't let them see what they can't understand." But the humiliation sat heavy. The irony wasn't lost on her. If any one of them knew the weight of her real service record, the nights she had flown dangerous missions protecting skies, they never thought twice about. Their laughter would falter. But that was the paradox of her career. Her best work was invisible, her victories classified, her sacrifices unnoticed. To them, she was just another traveler trying too hard. The flight attendants passed through the aisle, checking seatbelts and overhead bins. One paused, glancing at the group's quiet laughter, but chose not to intervene. Sarah recognized the look weariness. Flight attendants saw tensions daily. This one had chosen to let it pass. The plane pushed back, the safety video played, and the engines roared to life. Sarah focused on the hum of the aircraft, letting it steady her heartbeat. The man in 22B continued to shift and sigh dramatically, as though still amused by his own joke. Sarah stared at the seat back ahead, vision blurring slightly as she retreated inward. She thought of her squadron, of long nights sharing instant, coffee with crewmates, of whispered jokes in the cockpit to cut through fear. She thought of the faces she carried, comrades lost, names engraved in her memory. They were the reason she endured humiliation quietly, why she didn't lash out. Her battles weren't here. Yet the sting remained. She was thousands of feet above sea level in spirit already, but anchored to a middle seat where strangers' laughter became a reminder of how invisible her true life was. The captain's voice came over the intercom, welcoming passengers, promising smooth skies ahead. Applause scattered through the cabin, though it faded quickly into the rustle of seatbelts and shuffling magazines. Sarah closed her eyes briefly, drawing in another breath. Just get through the flight, she told herself. Ignore it. You've faced worse. But deep down, a whisper lingered. They'll never know who you really are. Outside, clouds gathered like silent witnesses, vast and indifferent. Inside, Sarah sat still, humiliated yet composed, unaware that far above and ahead, the airspace they were entering held a secret that would soon unravel every perception in that cabin. For now, though, in seat 22C, she was only the punchline of a joke. The plane climbed steadily, nose tilting toward a sky streaked with fading light. Below, the sprawl of the city shrank into a mosaic of glittering grids, highways glowing like golden threads, rivers cutting silver paths through the landscape. From her seat in 22C, Sarah watched the ascent without really seeing it. Her mind lingered on the laughter, the whispers that still seemed to hang in the air like residue. Passengers had settled, conversations resuming in pockets of idle chatter. The man in 22B pulled out his tablet, scrolling noisily through a stream of videos, occasionally chuckling at something on screen. Across the aisle, the woman who had mocked Sarah earlier was already reclining, eyes closed, lips parted in a faint smile of self-satisfaction. Sarah pressed her palms together, her thumbs grazing lightly as if in silent prayer. It wasn't prayer, not exactly. It was routine, one of the grounding techniques she had learned for long flights in hostile skies. Her body swayed slightly, with the subtle turbulence, but her posture never faltered. She was composed, but the echo of humiliation still throbbed like a bruise. The first bump came unexpectedly, a sharp pocket of air that rattled cups on tray tables and drew startled gasps. Sarah barely flinched. The second jolt followed moments later, stronger, sending a ripple of murmurs through the cabin. The captain's voice broke in, calm but edged with something sharper. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've encountered a patch of turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We'll be holding position for a short while. Sarah's eyes snapped open. Holding position? Commercial pilots didn't phrase delays that way. They spoke of circling, of waiting for clearance, of weather patterns. Holding position was the language of protocols, of controlled airspace and tactical necessity. Her ears pricked, catching nuances others didn't, the tone steady but strained. Not fear, not routine inconvenience. Urgency. Around her, passengers whispered, interpreting it in their own uninformed ways. Probably just a storm front, said one man a few rows ahead. No, it's probably congestion at the airport, muttered another. A young woman clutched her boyfriend's arm, eyes wide. Mechanical issue? They're not telling us everything. The speculation spread like wildfire. Nervous laughter filled the air, a way of cloaking fear. Sarah stayed silent, but her senses sharpened. She wasn't hearing passengers anymore. She was listening to the sky. She turned her head toward the oval window, narrowing her eyes. At first, she saw only cloud-thick tufts glowing faintly in the late sun. The engines droned with their steady hum, a sound Sarah knew intimately, each note tuned to her ear like a musician hearing keys in a song. But beneath that, she searched for something else. Her breathing slowed. In her memory, briefings replayed slides of potential airspace conflicts, emergency procedures, restricted zones around high-profile flights. Holding position at this altitude wasn't about weather. Something else was in play. Another jolt shook the aircraft, this one brief but sharp. Gasps again, followed by murmurs louder than before. A baby cried. The man in 22B muttered, "Typical. Airline can't handle a little turbulence." His ignorance grated, but Sarah didn't react. Her gaze was locked on the horizon. Then she saw it. At first, just a flicker sunlight glinting off polished metal, too quick for most eyes to notice. She leaned closer, squinting through the narrow frame. A sliver of silver streaked past, slicing through cloud with calculated precision. Her heart quickened. She knew that silhouette, knew the angles of its wings, the way it cut the air with authority. That wasn't a commercial jet. It was a fighter. Adrenaline surged, but not fear. Instinct. She sat straighter, scanning, watching for a second pass. Her fingers curled around the armrest unconsciously, not from nerves, but readiness. Passengers hadn't noticed. Conversations still buzzed complaints, jokes, theories. Sarah's eyes, however, locked on the sky outside. She had flown alongside those machines before, her own cockpit vibrating with their speed. She knew their purpose. Escorts didn't appear for weather. Escorts meant something, or someone significant was nearby. The captain's voice crackled again. "Ladies and gentlemen, we ask for your continued cooperation. For security reasons, we've been instructed to maintain our current altitude and heading. Everything is under control." The words only deepened the pit in Sarah's stomach. Security reasons. Rarely did those words enter announcements to passengers. They were a veil meant to calm, but to those who understood, they were a flag. The whispers grew frantic. Security reasons? What the hell does that mean? Is there a terrorist threat? Are we being hijacked? The woman across the aisle clutched her armrests, glancing around as if searching for someone to blame. The man in 22B sighed loudly, exasperated. "It's fine, people. They just don't want to scare us." He said it like he knew, though his eyes flickered with doubt. Sarah didn't move, didn't correct them. She only watched, breathing steady, pulse aligned with the rhythm of engines. She trusted more than the chatter of frightened passengers. She caught it again, another glint, closer this time. The sharp triangular silhouette of a jet-holding formation. Her stomach tightened. She could almost feel its presence, the vibration of its power through the thin skin of the cabin. Her humiliation, from earlier evaporated like mist, replaced by clarity. She was no longer a ridiculed traveler in 22C. She was a pilot, an officer, a woman trained to read the sky. And she knew, with absolute certainty, this was no routine diversion. Her hand pressed lightly against her thigh, steadying herself. The whispers grew, the fear spread, but Sarah knew the truth. The sky outside was speaking, and she understood its language. Something was unfolding above them, something larger than this flight, larger than the laughter, larger than the humiliation. She had endured moments ago. She leaned closer to the window, her eyes sharp. The clouds parted just enough, and there it was clear, undeniable. The Escort was real, and Seat 22C was no longer ordinary. The glint became undeniable. A second jet slid into view, its wings catching the late sunlight in a shimmer that set the cabin murmuring. It wasn't subtle. Whatever intention the Escort had, it was visible enough for passengers to notice. And they did. A boy near the window shrieked in excitement. "Mom!" A fighter jet. His voice carried down the rows, drawing heads to swivel. The boy plastered his face to the glass, pointing frantically. "Look, right there." At first, adults humored him. A few leaned across aisles to peek. Then they saw it too. Gasps replaced laughter. A ripple of awe and fear surged like a current through the cabin. "Holy, that's a military plane," someone said loudly. Another passenger muttered, "That can't be good." The man in 22B craned his neck toward Sarah's window. His earlier arrogance faltered, replaced by wide-eyed disbelief. "Is that?" He didn't finish. His voice caught in his throat. The whispers grew louder, stacking on top of each other, a chorus of speculation. "Are we in danger? Is there a threat on board? Why would we need an escort? Did someone smuggle something?" The cabin that had mocked Sarah minutes ago was now electrified with unease. The air felt thinner, tighter. The captain's voice returned, calm but firm, threaded with the professionalism of a man holding steady under unseen pressure. "Ladies and gentlemen, you may have noticed aircraft in our vicinity. There is no cause for alarm. We've been advised of restricted airspace ahead. Escorts are in place for precautionary measures. Please remain seated and follow crew instructions." The words did little to calm anyone. Instead, they ignited the nervous energy further. Passengers weren't reassured by precautionary measures. They latched on to the words restricted airspace as though they were code for imminent danger. A man 3 rows up blurted, "Restricted airspace? Over Kansas? That doesn't even make sense." His voice was high-pitched, almost panicked. Others debated in half-whispers that still carried. "Must be some kind of terror alert." No, it's a drill. Drills don't happen with you stuck in the middle of it." The woman across the aisle, once smirking at Sarah, now clutched her armrests with white knuckles. She muttered to no one in particular, "Why aren't they telling us everything? They always hide the truth." Sarah sat unmoving, her posture composed, though her senses thrummed with tension. To her, the announcement confirmed what she already suspected: restricted airspace. Escorts in formation. Not a drill. She angled her face toward the window, her eyes narrowing, watching the jet outside hold its precise line. That kind of flight wasn't casual. It was deliberate, calculated, protecting something, protecting someone. Her training whispered through. Her mind like a second language, one the rest of the cabin couldn't interpret. Escorts meant VIP, and there was only one VIP who carried an exclusion zone this vast, one whose flight path rerouted civilian aircraft at 30,000 feet. Her chest tightened. Air Force One. She hadn't thought of it in years. The protocols drilled into her during specialized assignments, the endless exercises that paired her squadron with contingency plans most civilians never knew existed. If the president's aircraft was nearby, every plane within a radius became a variable to control. They were variables now. The chatter grew more frantic. Phones rose to windows, shaky hands trying to capture blurry pictures of the jet streaking alongside them. Some passengers laughed nervously, as though framing the moment on video would turn fear into entertainment. Others whispered prayers. The man in 22B shifted in his seat, no longer lounging with mockery, but sitting stiff, shoulders tense. He glanced at Sarah, uncertainty flickering in his expression. His earlier smirk was gone, replaced by the dawning realization that the woman beside him seemed far calmer than anyone else. Sarah felt her pocket buzz. She stiffened. Discreetly, she slipped her hand into her jacket and drew out her phone. The screen glowed with an alert that bypassed normal notifications, a secure signal routed through encrypted channels. She hadn't seen one in years. Her breath hitched, but she masked it instantly. The message was short, no room for doubt. Phoenix, confirmed presence on board. Her call sign. Her pulse hammered. Phoenix wasn't a nickname tossed around casually. It was her operational identity, tied to missions buried deep under classification, missions she had once believed were locked away in the vault of her past. For it to appear here, mid-flight, meant she was not only recognized, but relevant right now. Her thumb hovered over the confirmation field. A flood of memory rushed through her night's flying combat air patrols, the constant buzz of radios. Filled with coded chatter, the feeling of steel beneath her gloves, as she guided her aircraft into positions most would never comprehend. Phoenix wasn't just a name. It was duty. Passengers continued to murmur around her, oblivious to the significance of the screen she held. Some debated terrorism, others foreign threats, still others wild conspiracies about UFOs. The air buzzed with fear disguised as curiosity. The man beside her noticed the glow of her phone. His eyes narrowed, catching the bold word at the top. Before she tilted it away, he blinked. Phoenix? His voice was a whisper, uncertain, but laden with questions. Sarah ignored him. She lowered her gaze, typed in the secure code she still remembered instinctively, and pressed confirm. The screen blinked, then cleared. Her confirmation had been received. Outside, the Escort shifted slightly, its angle adjusting in response to unseen orders. Sarah's breath steadied. Inside, the cabin remained a storm of speculation, but for her, everything crystallized into focus. The laughter, the humiliation, the whispers that had stung minutes ago, they were gone, dissolved in the clarity of her true role resurfacing. She was Phoenix again. And whatever was unfolding at 30,000 feet, Seat 22C was no longer just a seat. It was the place where her identity collided with destiny once more. The confirmation sent, Sarah locked her phone and slipped it quietly back into her pocket. She sat still, her face unreadable, though her pulse drummed with the weight of what she had just acknowledged. For the first time in years, Phoenix was active. Around her, the cabin was unraveling. Passengers leaned across aisles, whispered frantically, pointed toward the windows where the fighter jet gleamed against the clouds. A flight attendant hurried down the aisle, her voice forced into cheerfulness as she urged everyone to remain calm, though her eyes betrayed nervous glances toward the cockpit. The man in 22B fidgeted beside Sarah, tapping his knee in a jittery rhythm. He turned toward her, lowering his voice to a rasp meant only for her ears. Phoenix, what does that mean? I saw your phone. Sarah's gaze remained fixed forward. Her posture didn't shift. Years of military discipline had carved her ability to ignore distractions, to shield information behind the fortress of silence. She gave him nothing. The silence unsettled him. He leaned back, running a hand through his thinning hair. His earlier arrogance, the smirks, the mocking comments seemed almost absurd now. He couldn't reconcile the composed woman beside him with the rising panic in the cabin. The captain's voice returned, and this time it wasn't routine. It carried a gravity that settled like stone in the pit of every stomach aboard. Ladies and gentlemen, your flight crew has been in communication with air traffic control and national security officials. At this time, we are diverting temporarily to accommodate restricted airspace. Air Force One is transiting through this corridor. Escorts are in place to ensure security for the President of the United States. A stunned silence followed. It stretched long, too long, until it broke in a flood of disbelief. Air Force One? Someone repeated aloud, as though testing the words. You mean The president is up here right now? Are you serious? The buzz rose to a crescendo of awe and fear. Passengers craned for glimpses through small oval windows, desperate to catch sight of history in motion. Phones snapped. Pictures, though most frames caught only clouds. Some laughed nervously, others gasped. A few clapped, uncertain if celebration was appropriate. Sarah didn't move. She remained in her seat, eyes steady, the faintest tightening of her jaw. Only sign that the announcement had registered differently for her than for anyone else. She knew what this meant. Air Force One wasn't just an aircraft. It was a flying fortress, a beacon that reshaped the sky around it. Civilian planes were obstacles to reroute, potential threats to neutralize, variables to control. Their flight was no longer just a commercial journey. It was part of a larger theater, and she, Phoenix, had been drawn into its script. The man in 22B shifted again, his voice trembling now. Wait. If Air Force One is here, then why are those jets so close to us? Are we in the way? Are we... He cut himself off, realizing the panic in his own tone. He swallowed hard. You're calm. Too calm. You know something. Sarah finally turned her head, just slightly, her eyes meeting his. They were steady, unreadable, sharp. As a blade, she didn't speak. She didn't need to. The silence itself was an answer. Yes, she knew. The man's face flushed. He leaned back quickly, as though burned by the quiet intensity of her gaze. Across the aisle, the woman who had laughed at Sarah earlier now clutched a rosary, murmuring prayers. Her eyes darted nervously toward Sarah, as though the quiet figure in 22C had become a focal point she didn't understand. The fighter jet. Outside shifted its position, angling slightly upward, its sleek silhouette a reminder of invisible power. The cabin lights flickered momentarily as the plane adjusted course. Sarah's phone buzzed again. Another encrypted message. She checked it discreetly, shielding the glow with her hand. Phoenix confirmed. Stand by. That was all. No instructions, no explanations. Just acknowledgement. It was enough. Her composure deepened. She inhaled through her nose, exhaled slowly, aligning her breathing with the steady thrum of the engines. Her humiliation from earlier seemed distant now, trivial, a faint echo against the thunder of what was unfolding. The passengers were restless. Some whispered in awe, thrilled to be sharing skies with the president's aircraft. Others were pale with unease, interpreting the Escort as an omen of danger. The spectrum of human reaction: fear, excitement, denial played out in miniature within the cramped cabin. Sarah observed it all without judgment. She had seen this pattern before, in different forms. Civilians confronted with extraordinary circumstances often shifted quickly from mockery to reverence, from certainty to panic. It wasn't malice. It was the fragile human instinct to search for control in chaos. The captain spoke again, his tone calmer now, rehearsed for reassurance. Ladies and gentlemen, we will maintain this holding pattern until Air Force One has cleared the airspace. This is a historic moment, something few people ever experience firsthand. Please remain seated and enjoy the view if you're able. The crew tried to adopt the same cheer. A flight attendant whispered to another, wide-eyed, as they passed through the aisle. Sarah caught fragments, her name, her rank, carried in hushed tones. Word was spreading. The man in 22B leaned forward, elbows on his knees, head in his hands. He muttered softly, almost to himself, "This doesn't happen. This never happens." He turned again to Sarah, his voice edged with a mix of awe and regret. "Who are you really?" Sarah didn't answer. Her gaze returned to the window, where the jet outside cut through the sky with perfect discipline. The truth was irrelevant. To them, she wasn't here for their understanding or their approval. Her life had never been about applause from strangers. It was about quiet duty, unseen service, the kind that bent the trajectory of events without ever earning a headline. Still, in the cramped silence of 22C, the balance of perception had shifted. She was no longer the target of laughter. She was an enigma, a center of gravity around which whispers orbited. A earlier humiliation had been erased, replaced with a cautious reverence none of them could explain. Sarah adjusted her seatbelt, sitting taller. The moment was only beginning. Outside, the sky was alive with precision. Inside, the cabin was suspended in a rare stillness, every passenger aware that something extraordinary had engulfed their ordinary flight. And Sarah Mitchell Phoenix sat at its quiet core, waiting. It began as a shadow, a vast, slow-moving shape cutting through the glowing haze of clouds. At first, passengers pressed their faces to the windows with confusion. Then the sun hit it gleaming white and blue, a glint of polished metal unlike any other. The words United States of America stretched across its side in unmistakable authority. Gasps erupted. Air Force One. For a heartbeat, silence reigned. Then came the flood shouts of recognition, awe-struck exclamations, the frantic click of phone cameras trying to capture the impossible. Passengers craned across aisles, reaching over strangers, desperate for a glimpse. Oh my God. It's real. That's Air Force One. I can't believe this. We're right next to it. Look, you can see the flag. Voices overlapped, tumbling over one another, each person trying to stake their claim on the surreal moment. Sarah sat still, her eyes locked onto the aircraft, but her body remained calm, a steady anchor amid the chaos. She didn't need photos. She didn't need proof. She knew every line of that aircraft, not from textbooks or documentaries, but from classified training slides and operations where the safety of that very machine dictated the rhythm of her missions. It wasn't awe for her, it was recognition. The cabin, however, was electric. Laughter turned to cheers, fear to celebration. For a moment, the earlier humiliation she endured seemed impossible, as though it had happened on another plane, another world. Passengers were no longer mocking her. They were pressing toward her row, stretching to peer out her window. Move, please. Can I just see it for a second? A man begged from behind, practically leaning over Sarah's shoulder. The woman across the aisle clutched her rosary tighter, whispering louder now, though even her fear seemed tinged with reverence. The man in 22B didn't speak. He only stared, his jaw slack, his earlier smugness extinguished in the blaze of realization. His gaze darted between Sarah and the colossal aircraft outside, as though trying to connect two truths he had resisted minutes ago. The intercom chimed. A flight attendant's voice, trembling with excitement despite her attempt at professionalism, came over the speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, if you're on the left side of the aircraft, you may now see Air Force One. We ask that you remain seated, but enjoy this once-in-a-lifetime sight. Her words only fanned the frenzy. Phones waved in the air like lighters at a concert, flashes popping despite the futility against the bright sky. Some passengers even applauded, an instinctive burst of patriotism, though uncertain who or what they were clapping for. Sarah noticed the shift among the crew. The same flight attendant who had earlier dismissed the mocking atmosphere now approached her row cautiously. She bent closer, her voice low. Captain Mitchell? The name wasn't asked. It was acknowledged. Word had traveled fast. Sarah inclined her head slightly, her expression still composed. The attendant's eyes widened, respect dawning like sunrise. Thank you, she whispered, though she didn't specify what for. She didn't need to. The man in 22B turned sharply at the exchange. His mouth opened, then closed. A flush spread up his neck. He slumped back in his seat, staring. At his knees, shame thick in his silence. Outside, Air Force One soared with effortless majesty. Its sheer size dwarfed their commercial jet, a reminder of its symbolic and literal weight. Flanking fighters held tight formation, disciplined arcs cutting protective patterns through the sky. The sight was breathtaking, even to Sarah, who had once flown similar guardianship missions. The passengers buzzed like bees in a hive. Speculation ran wild. Where was the president going? Why this route? Why were they lucky enough to witness it? Every theory, every guess filled the air until the cabin seemed louder than the engines themselves. Sarah tuned it out. Her focus was inward, on memory and instinct. She remembered the radio crackle of missions past, the steady cadence of controllers issuing instructions, the knowledge that her aircraft's path could alter history. She remembered nights when she stared at the stars through a canopy, her own jet holding silent vigil while Air Force One passed safely beneath. Now she was on the other side, seated among civilians whose lives rarely brushed against the hidden machinery of power. And they didn't even realize that one of its cogs, her, was seated quietly in 22C. The irony wasn't lost on her. A flight attendant reappeared, smiling nervously, whispering again, "Captain, if you need anything at all, please let us know." The deference was unmistakable. The same uniform that had overlooked her humiliation now regarded her with respect bordering on awe. Sarah nodded once more, polite but detached. She didn't bask in it. Respect given under duress wasn't her aim. The man in 22B finally found his voice, though it was hoarse, hesitant. I didn't know." Sarah glanced at him, her eyes cool, unflinching. He swallowed hard. His gaze dropped again. "I'm sorry," he whispered. No reply came. Sarah didn't need to answer. Silence was heavier than words, and in it lay every unspoken truth. Passengers continued their frantic attempts to immortalize the moment. Some pressed phones to the windows, desperate to freeze the sight for social media. Others simply stared, stunned into reverence, murmuring prayers or patriotic phrases. Sarah remained the only one still, her breathing even, her eyes focused but calm. To her, the sight wasn't spectacle, it was responsibility. She understood what those escorts meant, what it took to maintain this corridor of protection, the layers of vigilance invisible to every camera. The cabin vibrated with awe, but Sarah sat in quiet steadiness. Her life had never been about applause or recognition. It had always been about moments like this, moments where the unseen shield held, where history passed safely, where no one beyond a handful of guardians ever knew the danger that had been averted. And now, for the first time, strangers around her glimpsed that shield, even if they couldn't comprehend her role in it. Seat 22C was no longer just another cramped spot in economy. It was a vantage point into history, a silent witness to the intersection of humiliation and vindication. And Sarah Mitchell Phoenix sat at its heart steady, composed, unseen yet undeniable. The hum of the cabin had changed. Moments earlier, it was a buzz of frantic chatter and disbelief. Now it felt more like a cathedral-hushed awe, reverent whispers, a collective understanding that something extraordinary was unfolding. The passengers leaned close, trading theories in low voices, their eyes darting constantly from the window back to Sarah. And then the formation shifted. Outside, the escort fighters drew tighter. What had been a loose, protective arc became a precision box around their commercial jet. It was no accident. Their aircraft, an ordinary passenger plane, was suddenly under the same shield that guarded the leader of the free world. Gasps filled the cabin again. Someone shouted, "There! Surrounding us now!" A woman clutched her husband's hand, her expression caught between awe and fear. Another passenger whispered breathlessly, "Why us? Why are they doing this? The answer was sitting in seat 22C. Sarah didn't flinch as the escorts maneuvered. To her, the choreography was familiar, almost comforting. She knew their spacing, their angles, the silent signals invisible to civilians, but etched into her muscle memory. This was the language of guardianship, one she had spoken countless times. But for everyone else in the cabin, it was like watching legends come to life. The passengers kept turning to her, eyes wide, voices stumbling over her name. She's someone, a man muttered 2 rows ahead. No, she's more than someone. She's military. You heard the attendant captain. Mitchell. Another leaned in close enough for Sarah to catch his words. What's her call sign again? Phoenix, right? They said Phoenix. The name traveled through the rows like wildfire. Phoenix. It carried a weight of mystery, of rebirth and power. Something greater than Sarah herself had ever claimed. Passengers whispered it with a mix of respect and awe, as though repeating it could anchor them to the moment. Phoenix is on board. Phoenix is here. Even the children hushed, sensing the gravity in their parents' tones. The humiliation Sarah had endured earlier was gone, dissolved like vapor in sunlight. In its place stood reverence. The man in 22B sat rigid, hands clasped tightly on his knees, his earlier arrogance reduced to silence. His eyes flicked toward Sarah again and again, guilt etched into the slump of his shoulders. He didn't dare speak. The intercom chimed. The captain of the flight, his voice steady but tinged with awe, spoke to the passengers. Ladies and gentlemen, as you may have noticed, we are currently in the company of an escort formation. This is a rare and extraordinary event. Please remain calm and seated. We are fully safe. A pause followed. The silence held an unspoken truth, something only Sarah could feel vibrating between the words. Then, softer, almost reverent, the captain added, and I would also like to acknowledge that we are honored today to have among us Captain Sarah Mitchell, known to her community as Phoenix. On behalf of the crew, ma'am, it is our privilege to fly you. The cabin erupted not in noise this time, but in a ripple of awe. Some passengers gasped audibly, others straightened in their seats, as though sitting taller could somehow express their respect. A few even clapped quietly, the sound awkward but sincere. Sarah kept her eyes forward, expression calm, posture composed. She gave no outward sign of pride, but her chest rose just slightly higher, her shoulders set in the quiet dignity of someone who had carried a heavy mantle unseen, and now, for the first time, was recognized in front of strangers. Whispers continued to cascade through the rows. She's Phoenix. She must have been the one flying those missions. She's the reason. The stories spun wildly, each passenger filling the gaps with imagination. Some guessed she had once saved Air Force One directly. Others speculated she was on call for emergencies, summoned by codes no civilian could understand. None of them knew the truth in detail, but it didn't matter. The aura of Phoenix filled the void. A flight attendant approached again, kneeling beside Sarah's row so her voice wouldn't carry. Her expression was soft, her eyes bright with admiration. Captain Mitchell, she said carefully, the crew would like to know if you'd be willing to speak with us privately after landing. Just to say thank you. Sarah inclined her head slightly, her tone even. We'll see what's appropriate. The attendant nodded, retreating with visible respect. The man in 22B finally turned, his voice breaking the silence he had wrapped himself in. Phoenix, he said, his tone low, almost reverent. I shouldn't have. His words trailed off, shame strangling the rest. Sarah met his gaze briefly. No malice burned in her eyes, only the unshakable calm of someone who had faced real battles and understood the insignificance of petty mockery. She didn't reply. Forgiveness wasn't hers to give, wasn't needed. Silence was enough. Outside, the escorts held firm, their wings glinting sharp in the sunlight. They weren't just flying in protection, they were making a statement. Every passenger aboard knew it now. This wasn't coincidence. Air Force One wasn't just near them. It had bent its path, adjusted its course, because Phoenix was aboard this flight. The power of that truth settled heavy in the cabin. Passengers looked at Sarah not as a fellow traveler, not even as a soldier, but as something larger, a living embodiment of quiet heroism. The atmosphere had transformed completely. What began as ridicule had become reverence. No one laughed now. No one dared. Every word was careful. Every glance toward her weighted with gratitude or awe. Even the restless teenager who had kicked her seat earlier now sat perfectly still, wide-eyed, watching her like a legend stepped out of a story. Sarah sat with composure, but inside she felt the paradox sharpen. Recognition was fleeting, applause even more so. What mattered, what had always mattered, was the unseen duty. The times no one clapped, the missions no one witnessed, the lives saved in silence. That was her truth. Yet, for this brief passage through the sky, the unseen had become visible. Seat 22C was no longer an afterthought, no longer a cage of humiliation. It had become a pedestal of quiet vindication, a place where strangers learned the weight of sacrifice in the most unexpected way. And Sarah Mitchell Phoenix, moored as she always had, with calm, with dignity, and with silence that said more than words ever could. The fighter escorts shifted again, banking in a graceful arc that drew murmurs from passengers. From the oval windows, their movement looked like a dance, precise and practiced, every wing tilt calculated. The cabin hummed with awe as the jets repositioned, clearing a corridor of airspace for the majestic figure in the distance. Air Force One. The presidential aircraft gleamed like a symbol carved out of the sky, sunlight bouncing from its fuselage in regal brilliance. It was not merely a plane. To everyone staring through the glass, it was the embodiment of authority, a vessel of power, and a promise of protection. Passengers gasped, their phones pressed against the glass, snapping pictures feverishly as though desperate to capture proof they were part of history. Some whispered prayers. Others simply sat slack-jawed, reverent in the presence of something they had only seen on television. And still, Sarah Mitchell remained still. Seat 22C had been the stage of her humiliation. Only an hour earlier, when cruel laughter had chipped at her dignity. But now, that very seat had transformed into a throne of sorts, not by her choice, but by the revelation of her identity, Phoenix. The intercom chimed again. The captain's voice, once purely procedural, now carried pride that swelled with each word. Ladies and gentlemen, it is with great honor that I inform you. We are temporarily diverting to create a safe air corridor for Air Force One. This is a privilege few flights will ever experience. Please join me in recognizing that our skies today are shared with the President of the United States. Cheers erupted. Applause rolled through the cabin like a wave, passengers clapping as if they had rehearsed. But then the captain paused, and his voice dropped into something more personal. And for those of you unaware, we are also privileged to have on board Captain Sarah Mitchell, known by her call sign, Phoenix. Her service and sacrifice are tied directly to the very security we are now witnessing. It is not every day you discover a guardian of our nation seated quietly among us. Captain, on behalf of my crew and every passenger here, thank you. A clapping turned thunderous. Passengers craned to look at Sarah, some nodding, some murmuring thanks aloud. Even children waved, not fully understanding, but sensing the magnitude. The humiliation from earlier had been obliterated, buried beneath layers of respect. Sarah's face remained composed, her hands folded calmly in her lap. She nodded once, acknowledging the gratitude without basking in it. She had learned long ago that applause was temporary. Duty was permanent. Still, something in her chest shifted, not pride exactly, but a quiet acknowledgement that, just for a moment, the unseen had been seen. The man in 22B sat stiff, his hands trembling slightly. The guilt that had been gnawing at him all flight now forced its way out in words. He leaned closer, speaking just above a whisper. "Captain Mitchell, Phoenix, I owe you an apology. Earlier, I mocked you. I laughed. His voice cracked, his throat tightening. I didn't know who you were. I didn't know what you'd done. And now, I feel ashamed." Sarah turned her head slowly, her gaze steady but not unkind. She studied him for a long moment before replying in a voice calm, measured, and devoid of resentment. "You weren't supposed to know." He blinked, confusion flickering across his face. "What do you mean?" "Service," she said simply. "It isn't about being recognized. It isn't about people clapping or saying thank you. It's about doing what must be done, even if no one ever sees it, even if no one ever knows your name." Her words hung in the air like scripture, simple yet profound. The man swallowed hard, his shame deepening. But still, it was wrong. "You've given so much, and I—" He shook his head, unable to finish. Sarah offered him no comfort, but neither did she condemn him. Instead, she returned her gaze to the window, watching the escorts carve their protective path across the kiln. Clouds, the silence between them spoke louder than words could. Around the cabin, passengers were still whispering her call sign like a mantra. Phoenix. Some speculated about missions she might have flown, others about medals she might have received. They would never know the truth, not in detail, but the mystery only amplified their reverence. The atmosphere felt transformed. Gone was the restless chatter of bored travelers. Now, the cabin carried the solemn weight of a sacred ceremony. Every person aboard seemed aware they were witnessing a convergence of history and humanity, where anonymity had collided with recognition. Sarah closed her eyes briefly, letting memories stir. Nights in foreign skies, radar screens glowing in dim cockpits, the thrum of engines beneath her hands. Missions that began and ended in silence, never to be spoken of, each one leaving its mark. Comrades lost, victories unsung. The weight of all of it pressed against her chest now, not as burden, but as reminder. Recognition was fleeting. Duty was eternal. The escorts banked again, signaling their final maneuver. Air Force One soared ahead, gliding toward its destination with the assurance of safety. Slowly, deliberately, the fighters peeled away, one by one, disappearing into the distance like guardians fading into myth. The captain returned to the intercom, his tone almost wistful. "Ladies and gentlemen, our escort is departing now. Air Force One will continue on its course. We'll resume our original heading shortly. Please take a moment to appreciate the history you've just witnessed. This is not an ordinary day in the skies." The cabin exhaled collectively. The applause faded into hushed conversation. The awe lingered. Sarah leaned back into her seat, her body relaxed, but her mind steady. She hadn't sought this moment, hadn't asked for it, but it had come, unbidden, and she had carried it with the same quiet dignity she carried every unseen mission. The man beside her whispered again, softer this time, almost reverent. "Thank you, Phoenix." Sarah opened. Her eyes met his gaze briefly, and then closed them again. She didn't need his apology, his gratitude, or anyone's applause. She had lived her truth long before they saw it. For her, the escort in the skies was not validation. It was simply continuity, the endless thread of service, woven invisibly through time. Seat 22C remained the same cramped middle seat it had always been. But for everyone else aboard, it had become something greater. And Sarah Mitchell Phoenix remained what she had always been, a guardian who carried the weight of duty not for recognition, but for the unshakable belief that freedom was worth the silence. The roar of engines outside softened as the escort jets receded into the distance, melting back into the horizon. Air Force One, its blue and white livery gleaming like a crown in the sky, banked slightly and vanished from the window's frame. Silence filled the cabin, heavier than the cheers that had erupted minutes earlier. It was a silence of reverence. The passengers, who had moments ago been fumbling for phones and gasping like tourists at a monument, now sat quietly, digesting what they had witnessed. Some clutched their armrests, as if grounding themselves after brushing so close to history. Others simply stared out into the endless clouds, faces softened by awe. The flight attendant's voice broke the stillness. "Ladies and gentlemen, Air Force One and its escort have cleared our corridor. We'll be resuming our original course shortly. Please remain seated as we continue with normal service." The phrase normal service felt almost laughable. Nothing about the last hour had been normal. Every passenger knew they would carry this story for years, an anecdote told at dinners, offices, family gatherings. They had seen the president's aircraft. They had been diverted by fighter jets. And perhaps most unexpectedly, they had discovered a living piece of that hidden machinery of protection, seated quietly among them in row 22. Sarah Mitchell Phoenix. The name carried through the cabin in whispers still, though now with weight, reverence, and even caution, as if speaking it too loudly might shatter its sanctity. Sarah herself sat with her eyes closed, her breathing slow, her hands resting lightly in her lap. She felt the curious stares, the silent thanks, the shift in air around her, but she did not meet it. Recognition was not something she chased, nor something she rejected. It was simply unnecessary. The man in 22B sat rigid beside her, his earlier apology still hanging between them. He didn't try again. He knew words could not undo the sting of his laughter or erase the shame of his assumptions. All he could do now was sit beside her in quiet respect, humbled by the enormity of who she was and what she represented. The engines leveled, the hum steadying. Outside, the sky stretched endless, indifferent to the drama that had unfolded beneath its watch. Sarah allowed her mind to drift, not to the cabin or its passengers, but to the memories stitched across her years of service. She thought of nights when she had flown missions in radio silence, her squadron weaving unseen paths through danger. She thought of comrades lost, names etched in stone, honored only by those who remembered them. She thought of the long hours training, sweating, preparing, never for applause, but for readiness. All of it had led to this moment in Seat 22C, not a triumph, not a humiliation, but a reminder. Service was invisible until the world briefly glimpsed its shadow. The captain returned over the intercom. His voice, though calm, betrayed a note of reverence still. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent into our destination. Please fasten seatbelts and prepare for landing. I want to thank you for your cooperation during today's unique circumstances. This will be a flight none of us forget." The descent began. Clouds thickened outside the window, the landscape of the earth slowly rising to meet them. As the seatbelt chime echoed, passengers shifted, but their movements lacked the restless impatience of usual landings. Conversations were hushed, glances soft, as though the cabin had become a chapel. People who had once dismissed Sarah now saw her as something entirely different, not just a soldier, not just a pilot, but a living embodiment of sacrifice. One elderly woman across the aisle leaned toward Sarah, her voice trembling but sincere. "Thank you, dear. Thank you for what you've done for all of us." Sarah inclined her head politely, offering no words. Gratitude was appreciated, but it was not the currency of her life. The plane pierced through cloud cover, the ground sprawling below in patchworks of green, gray, and steel. As wheels touched down, a gentle cheer rippled through the cabin, more from relief than excitement. Passengers clapped, a customary gesture at safe landings, though today it carried a deeper resonance. Applause felt like a tribute, a recognition of more than just skilled pilots at the controls. The plane rolled to its gate, engines powering. Down in gradual whines. The cabin lights brightened, casting a new clarity on every face. Passengers gathered belongings, but their chatter was subdued, their movements deliberate. Many glanced once more toward row 22, where Sarah remained composed, neither rushing nor lingering. A man in 22B cleared his throat softly. "Captain Mitchell," he said, voice low. "I may not deserve to ask, but can I tell people I sat beside Phoenix?" Sarah turned her head, studying him for a long moment. Her eyes were steady, unreadable. Then she shook her head gently. "Tell them you sat beside someone who served. That's enough." His throat tightened, and he nodded, understanding more. In that single reply than in any lecture he could have received, the overhead bins clicked open. Bags were pulled down. Passengers queued for the narrow aisle, but even in their impatience, they stepped aside for Sarah. Some offered nods, others small smiles. A few whispered thanks as she passed. She accepted none of it with more than a nod. She moved steadily, gracefully, as though stepping from one mission to another. The jet bridge extended, the cabin doors opened, and passengers spilled into the terminal, already pulling out phones, already rehearsing the stories they would tell. But Sarah did not linger. She walked with quiet purpose, her plain clothes, blending her back into anonymity. To anyone watching from afar, she was simply another traveler among hundreds. Only those who had sat within that cabin knew the truth. And perhaps that was how it should remain. Outside, sunlight bathed the runway, glinting faintly on distant contrails where escorts had once carved their protective arcs. Air Force One was long gone, carrying its burden of power and responsibility elsewhere. The world continued, unaware of the small drama that had unfolded in Seat 22C. For Sarah Mitchell Phoenix, it was simply another day. Another reminder that service was not about fame, nor humiliation, nor fleeting recognition. It was about doing what was required, silently, invisibly, until the skies themselves testified to the weight of sacrifice. As she disappeared into the terminal, the words from earlier echoed faintly in her mind. The apology, the thanks, the captain's announcement. She let them go, releasing them like vapor into the air. For gratitude was never the goal. Her goal had always been the same: to guard, to protect, to fly unseen so others could live unburdened. Seat 22C, once a place of ridicule, had become something else entirely. Not a throne, not a stage, but a reminder of the quiet strength found in service without recognition. And so, as she melted into the crowd, Phoenix became Sarah again, unseen, uncelebrated, but always present, always ready. The sky outside remained endless, waiting for its guardians.